Hello, welcome to Social Evolution, a show where we talk about the future of humanity, things like technology, culture, institutions, and more. I'm Michael Porcelli.
And I'm Max Borders. If you're just joining us, this is our video debut, so I want to welcome everyone.
Yeah, welcome everybody. What are we talking about today, Max?
Yeah, we're going to talk about polycentric governance, sometimes called polyarchy. There's a little bit of difference between these two, but we're going to get into that. It sounds like it's some kind of really strange, boring academic thing, but it's actually really, really important.
Right. And I know you and me have talked about like what sort of sucks about the current political system, the two-party system, these failure modes or these kind of ways of organizing that maybe people have accepted as like a status quo for maybe even most of their lifetimes. Maybe they haven't even thought about this kind of stuff before, but it's in the air. People are talking about like, how can we do this civilization thing better than we have been? And this is kind of our favorite one, right? I mean, this is something that is, instead of talking about what's wrong with the current thing, we could be talking about how to do it in a whole new and exciting way, right?
Right. I mean, look, I don't want this to come across as a partisan or even a particularly ideological episode. Now, there is an ideological element to it, in that you either think that there should be a whole bunch of competing jurisdictions, and that those jurisdictions, by virtue of competition, draw people into their orbit successfully or not, or you don't, and you think that there's one true way and that should be implemented on everyone in humanity, right? And that's really, I think, in some sense, the case of decentralism versus centralism. But I want to step back for a moment from that and start talking about why we would want to overcome any sort of status quo bias. You know, on the right, some people might say, well, we just need to, enforce the Constitution the way it is, go back to the original constitutional mandate, and everything would be gravy, right? And then on the left, you're going to hear people who are, big proponents of another one true way, and that's usually some sort of technocratic scheme that gets imposed on everybody by some elite intellectuals who seek to plan or socially engineer society for under one conception of the good and not multiple conceptions of the good. So we have this fundamental tension between these two forms of what I would call centralism. And I think that we are becoming complex enough in our social systems and our economic systems that it's time to think really differently about this. And of course, we can appeal to the wisdom of the founders in this regard, but not everything is about the wisdom of the founders. So, stepping back for a moment, can you tell us just a minute, about Chesterton's fence? I think that's a good place to start, because I think I can hear the voices now of people saying, "Don't forget about Chesterton's fence."
Right. So, this is a kind of a known thinker. I don't know, somewhat of a modern, as in the modern era of philosophy. He's like whatever, 100 years old or 200. I don't even know where somewhere around there. Chesterton kind of had a conservative concept where he's like, you come to a fence, you don't know why it's there, and you might be like, fuck it, get rid of this fence. It shouldn't belong here. It's in the way, and let's just change it. And he's kind of making an idea of like, don't just go change things without fully understanding why they were there in the first place. And anytime ideas of progress or progressivism or revolutionary change come up, conservatives like to, kind of like, let's hesitate for a second and let's just understand what's good about what we've done so far, so we don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. That's sort of another metaphor that gets used to kind of, let's think carefully. And if you and I are gonna just talk about crazy new ideas of governance, like at the very least we need to be challenging our own ideas in terms of like, well, let's not, get rid of stuff that's good or that should be preserved, that we might sort of screw up things along the way, if we get too radical in our ideas, right?
Right. And look, we don't want to go too far. We want to acknowledge the wisdom in the sort of Chesterton's fence thinking and say, yeah, you're absolutely right. You don't want to ruin what's working. And in fact, you want to look at what is working and perhaps even do a little more of it. So, for example, I'm a really big fan of the common law. Okay. And common law is an ancient tradition of customary law that extends back centuries. And it works. It works, and it worked well through those centuries. Of course, as you move forward in time, you get the common law sort of in Justinian law, which is more like statute law, where you get all of these smart minds in the same room who are going to hammer out everything for the rest of society. That these two forms of law are somewhat at odds. And that's not to say that there isn't a Chesterton's fence view of statute law, like, hey, the U.S. Constitution was a product of statute, not of common law. Sure. But I think, we don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater, to use the proverb, right? And we also want to respect Chesterton's fence. And I think what we're suggesting in new forms of governance are a meta doctrine, not a doctrine per se. It's not a one true way kind of thinking, but rather let's figure out how to instantiate different kinds of niches that allow us to experiment with different conceptions of the good. And you're going to get, sorry to say this, G.K. Chesterton, but Charles Darwin's going to come in and do some work here, which is to say, stupid ideas and stupid niches are going to fail.
Right. Yeah. So one of the things that I like about where we're going with this is, just to come back to this one true way idea, like the larger jurisdictions have become historically, and you can kind of see almost a cycle in history, like the rise and then the fall of like the Roman Empire or the Mongolian Empire or the Chinese Empire, like these things that kind of get really, really big, but like as they get bigger, there becomes like this like almost inevitably like an internal corrosive process where there's essentially political infighting over this one true way, because this is the metaphor of the One Ring in the Lord of the Rings. It's like now everyone's just clamoring to kind of command a huge jurisdiction and all of the resources therein, and maybe that's like power hungry, or it kind of attracts sociopaths, or maybe it turns people into sociopaths who like end up in these offices. And like this is a little bit of the problem with what we have, but I think there is like
exactly
not just the psychology of it, but this, when you bring Darwin into it, like this idea, and even systems theory, like this idea that like a healthy and robust ecosystem, for example, is one where there's a lot of different approaches, right? When we see this, metaphorically, and maybe it's more than just a metaphor in like biology, where you have all these different species that are like handling the acquisition and the reproduction of energy and survival and these kind of factors in many very different and inventive ways. And I think there is a way that I sort of see this polycentrism and polyarchy thing that we're talking about as being, at the very least, analogous to this idea of, you might say, like biodiversity in ecology, which actually makes the whole system itself more robust and less kind of brittle to these, corruption, change, like it's all just one true way sort of thing. If it's all one true way, then and you succeeded it, then there's like a huge vulnerability. Like if that one true way fails, then what you're talking about is like a civilization level collapse, which arguably we're in the middle of something that looks like it could be that.
Yeah, obviously I wrote a book about it called After Collapse, and I am concerned about such a state of affairs. I think, that concern is basically Nassim Taleb's idea of anti-fragility versus fragility, or an anti-fragile state of affairs, is one in which you get these experiments in within a system, and it's anti-fragile to the extent that it allows for multiple experiments in the system, but the failures are local and not catastrophic, right? So to give you a more an example of fragility, you get not to pick on one partisan team, because I'm not into partisan team sports at all, but the one that happens to be in power now is the one we ought to pick on most, right? And that's the Biden administration. Biden came in, okay, you've got all these people defecting from the state of California. No offense. I know you're in California. I'm in Texas. I like to pick on you about this because it's in good fun. But people from your state are coming to my state in droves. And there's a good reason for that. Your state has high taxes. Its cities are, crumbling and filled with homeless people. And there's all sorts of problematic aspects to living in California, despite the weather, the beauty, and all that good stuff. And I can see why you would want to stick around. I really do. But at the end of the day, the net migrations from your state to mine are obvious. And yet, after he was elected, President Biden said something to the effect of, we want to reproduce at the federal level what Californians have done at the state level. Right? Which is to take all of the policies, the bundle of policies and experiments and governance that California has made, and apply it writ large. And when you do that, you're introducing a hell of a lot of risk to the entire system, because at that point, the costs of exiting any given jurisdiction, you got 50 of them here, at least right now, they're not all under the sway of a California style governance system. If they were, there would be far fewer options for people to escape to, if you catch my meaning. So that is, that diversity, institutional diversity, whether the institutions are that great or fair to middling, that's all going to be really up to your idea of what's good and what you're willing to pay in taxes, and what you think is promising or progressive, for that matter. And of course, not everyone agrees about that. So we get terms lately on both sides of the aisle, like national divorce and so on. But I would like to see a system that is also more than the red app and the blue app. Even if you could have some kind of system that is a little more pluralistic, where it's easier and lower cost to go to another jurisdiction. We don't want there just to be two apps on our iPhone. We don't want there to be two jurisdictions in our country.
Right. So, what I like about what you said, and this is, I don't want to dwell too much on the current political state in the country, but like there is this natural tension, especially in it's almost like a cognitive dissonance in kind of policies of the political left or progressivism, where it's like there's sort of a desire for more bundling, like you said, right? More social services, social benefits, whether this is like, national versions of healthcare or social security systems, or any kind of like entitlements, or these kinds of, ways that the state provides, right? And the more that is there, that sort of becomes kind of increasingly attractive, I suppose, for people of a certain political minds, but also people that maybe come from more impoverished countries. Like especially in the US, we think of like, south of the border and the, migration in this direction. And in Europe, you kind of have this kind of migration coming more from, near whatever, East Asia or Middle East, and like towards Europe, because the social infrastructure is better there. And then here's the cognitive dissonance. It's like, well, the left also wants more open borders and more kind of free movement of people and migration and a generous sort of thing. But like, if you do both of those things at the same time, you kind of create an attractor for migration, and then you kind of like remove the kind of barriers to entry, and you're essentially like writing checks. You're creating future debt for generations to come, and potentially like overloading the infrastructure that you're so excited to build. And this comes back to this, the reason why that happens is because we have this construct, this centralized nation state, this Westphalian order that we've had for several hundreds of years, where somehow, we those political maps or globes, from like elementary schools, right? There's like these little colored lines, right? Surrounding little geographic chunks. And it's like we've carved up the whole, land surface of the earth into these, jurisdictions. And we've said like, all right, this is it. This is how we're going to organize humanity, from here on out. We're going to have these, fixed borders and these kind of monopolistic entities called states that run them or something like this. And that in a way is the thing that the foundation of what we're questioning, isn't it? In some way, like.
Well, I mean, look, I'm not a big Rawlsian, okay? Meaning John Rawls, the philosopher. But he has an interesting thought experiment called the veil of ignorance, right? And it's like, okay, pretend that you're in a pre-birth state. You don't know where you're going to be born. You don't know how you're going to be born. What should justice look like? Well, there are some problematic aspects to that because, at the very least, it runs squarely into the real world. So let's pretend like we're talking about the real world and you're coming into this pre-birth state. You're in this pre-birth state and you imagine what it would be like to be born in one of these. And at the very least, this exercise can show us how arbitrary things are with respect to when you are born. You're born onto a certain patch of soil that has attached to it these certain kinds of rules that are enforced by, by these authorities with guns and jails, and just about anywhere you are on the planet, which is, which. It not only exposes the arbitrariness of that, and I think, someone might say, well, it's not arbitrary. War and conquest isn't that arbitrary. But it's like, from the standpoint of someone who's just being born and growing up under a certain jurisdiction or another, it's like you have to accept these rules no matter what. Otherwise, you have to immigrate or defect or whatever you want to call it. And that process, that immigration, that change, that voting with your vote, if you have more opportunities to vote with your vote, and this pushes back a little bit against this idea of having this membrane that you want to protect. This is our way of life. I understand that, and if you have more jurisdictions and more possibilities for people of all socioeconomic levels to be able to transition among these, you get competitive dynamics, and that's really what we want to unpack. I think with this idea is lowering the cost of exiting any jurisdiction that isn't working for you and lowering the cost of entering another jurisdiction that is more likely to work for you.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So, like, what does this look like? I think there's ways we can sort of talk about places this shows up, right? Like you could think of the federal system of the U.S. and the relationship of the state governments to the federal government as like a version of this, right? Or you could think of maybe a slightly more radical version of the canton system in Switzerland, right? Like which
I think is a superior system. I mean, that's beautiful. I mean, Switzerland is already a smaller state as it is, more manageable number of people, more similar cultures, despite the differences in the cantons. And yet they still have a federal system where there's more cultural, social, and economic determination within that canton.
Right.
I like the Swiss model very much, even though it's not some perfect ideal system. It is definitely superior to ours in many regards, I think.
It's still territorial, but I want to open the gateway for our conversation here, and instead of just kind of we can refer back to things that exist that are like what we're imagining when we imagine polyarchy or polycentrism. But I mean, let's really push the envelope here and talk about like what's possible if we could wave a magic wand and turn the whole earth into a polycentric order or a polyarchic order. Like, what does that start to look like? Because, I can imagine that it's, at least for people who haven't been like into this kind of geekery like you and me, they may be having like a hard time totally imagining it. Like these ideas seem somewhat
wacky,
far-fetched, right? Like, wait,
yeah.
there's no more countries? You know, is this like John Lennon idealism or like no borders? What the heck? What is it?
It's actually quite similar to in before he died, Thomas Jefferson wrote a series of letters to some of his colleagues after he was president. And he saw the process of the constitutional order being corrupted even as early as his presidency. And he expressed concerns about it. So he proposed this idea in a letter called ward republics. And the idea of the ward is that you might not have any more than 1,000 people in a ward. I can't remember if that's the exact number, if there was a number ascribed to it, but the idea is local governance predominates. And that's really what we're talking about. What is the lowest possible jurisdiction with the greatest possible power to instantiate or make a decision at the local level? Because the more of those you have, the closer you can get to unanimity, to town hall discussions, whatever your consensus mechanism is for governance in that jurisdiction, it's much more likely to make some kind of rational sense with fewer people. So that's one thing. But the other thing is, when we acknowledge pluralism, I have some friends who are, you might call classical liberal or libertarian, and there are all these debates that have gone on endlessly between the anarchists on the one side and the minimal statists on the other, okay?
The minarchists.
The minarchists, all right. Anarchism versus minarchism. And it's really, in my opinion, and, push back if you like, folks, but it's a silly debate because you're looking at two sets of ideals that from which we're very far away, right? So it's like, okay, yes, we need some sort of North Star, some sort of idealized North Star to move towards, and I acknowledge that, I grant that. For at least from a strategic standpoint, you can't, if you don't have that North Star, you don't know where you're going. But the idea that it could be sort of instantiated tomorrow in some constitutional moment or something is kind of crazy. Even if we had a collapse scenario like we were talking about, and the United States government was no longer able to hold sway over 350 million people. There's just all kinds of ideas swimming around amongst those people about how we should be governed, and that's going to require some sort of adjudication process that's going to be imperfect, and it's going to have to take into account people where they are. So getting to some ideal is never going to be perfect. In fact, the U.S. founding was about as close as we've ever gotten to any such thing. And I think we can pretty much admit at this point that the constitutional order that they envisioned is being eroded and is in decline.
Right. So, I mean, let me just, try to imagine somebody who's just listening to these ideas for the first time. And, one kind of common intuition would be like, well, it does seem like there's some mutual benefit from aggregating ourselves into collectives of some kind, right? I mean, we talk about, ancient tribes of people or corporations or, city states for a while. Like, it seems like, when we pool our resources together and find some way of, making arrangements with each other, we benefit. So it seems like inevitably we're going to want to aggregate or collectivize to some degree. Are you just sort of saying that it's the size of what that collective is, and we're sort of trying to like find a different size, and maybe your polycentrism is this, like, maybe there should just be more of these jurisdictions, like there's more free movement between them is something I'm hearing you say, but like there also needs to be more of a variety, because this other idea you're saying is like the fact of pluralism, and this doesn't mean just total like there's no such thing as truth and it's just kind of some kind of radical form of relativism, but it does mean like just the fact that there's people are sort of different, they're going to have different
they're going to have different preferences and opinions. A lot of people are going to say, I really want to live in something like a Swedish social state, something that looks more like Vermont. And then next door, there are going to be other people say, actually, no, I really like it over here in New Hampshire. I mean, we
Right.
already have this to a very great degree. And we, you know, we see this migration between and among the states, but the variation among the different states is quite small. And of course, when you have this Goliath monstrosity of the federal government sitting on top of this system,
Right.
when you have that sitting atop the system, it's top heavy, it's generated debt and unfunded liabilities, the likes of which is unprecedented in history. There's really a lot of problems there in terms of what this monstrous federal government is doing. It's sitting on the backs of the states and of the people. And that is unconstitutional if you believe the 9th and 10th Amendments are supposed to mean something, but they don't. They mean absolutely nothing. So that's a problem. The second problem is, and goes to Friedrich Hayek. Okay, Friedrich Hayek is a famous philosopher / economist who was considered in the liberal tradition in the 20th century of the Austrian tradition. And his idea was we have to, in order to be able to have any form of organization that makes sense, we either have to have local knowledge or market prices, right? Because with greater complexity, you have to have some sort of impartial adjudication mechanism for how resources are to be dealt with, and that's the price system. But if you're talking about local organization in which you might organize yourself into some sort of hierarchical firm, he was really interested in local knowledge, the circumstances of time and place, he called it. So if governance is to be, is to be carried out, it has to be local in the sense that when you outsource the responsibility for governance to these massive, titanic elections over 350 million people to a body of lawyers in Washington to deliberate over what's supposed to hold sway for 350 million people in a country who are very different, you start to see how local knowledge has nothing to do with it at all. And that's where we start to get some of these problematic aspects, like the decay of the republic, and that people feel that as they say, Washington is out of touch, and the only way they stay in touch with Washington is to follow the spectacles of national politics that really mean that they really can't participate in it to any appreciable degree. As we said before in one episode on this, you cry your teardrop in the ocean every 4 years and expect the tide to turn, and of course it never does.
It does. True. So, I mean, I want to kind of turn our eyes and kind of like nudge our conversation towards like the future. Like if we could just wipe the slate clean or start making a thing, like, I mean, what would, maybe we can get kind of concrete about it. Like, what does it look like when you're a citizen in like, let's just imagine we had our way and we have a future that is in a kind of a polyarchic order. Are we all sort of like extra civic minded? Like we all sort of are kind of part of different councils? Like, or do we have like many memberships in many different entities that all kind of govern different aspects? How do I figure out when and if I can kind of move? I mean, even simple things that kind of come up in, basic, public works discussions and like high school kind of civics classes. Like, well, do you have like, is everybody laying their own railroad tracks or digging their own ditches and putting cables in? Is it just fucking chaos in the roads? And I mean, like, how does this work? How do you have like, aren't there kind of natural?
I mean, if we can't figure out who builds the roads, then we should just forget all this. I'm just kidding. No, it's a really good question. It's a really good question. And, there's this Belgian liberal in the classical tradition, wrote in 1860. His name is Du Puydt, DE space PUYDT. And we can put that in the show notes. His idea is, I think, a bit idealistic in the sense of how do we get there from here?
Sure.
But it's at least instructive as a thought experiment.
Let's talk about what it looks like. Yeah.
Yeah. So he says, my panacea, if you'll allow the term, is simply free competition in the business of government. Everyone has the right to look after his own welfare as he sees it and to obtain security under his own conditions. On the other hand, this means progress through contests between governments forced to compete for followers. This is really the essence of it. We already have this in our federal system now. So, and by the way, he says, if disagreement came about between subjects of different governments or citizens, he says subjects because he was living in a different time, or between one government and the subject of another, it would simply be a matter of observing the principles hitherto observed between neighboring peaceful states. And anything else would be the business of ordinary courts of justice. So we have already these dispute resolution mechanisms. Now, questions about whether that superordinate jurisdiction means it's a greater state or whatever, these are all questions of implementation. But at the very least, he paints a picture of how competition between and among these jurisdictions can happen. And here's what's interesting about polyarchy or panarchy. Du Puydt calls it panarchy. He does not see, he thinks it's kind of crazy that rules, at least all rules, should be affixed to some territory. Right? He basically says it's simply a matter of declaration before one's local political commission without even the necessity of removing one's dressing gown or slippers. So he's saying you could sign up for the Democratic Party governance system. You could sign up for the Republican Party governance system. You could sign up for the Zionists, whatever you want, as long as there is, that there's no conflict between and among the states. And there might be now. There's conflicts between and among states right now for political, economic, and cultural reasons today. So that's always going to be a threat. The question is, would it be more of a threat? After World War II, the idea was to have this kind of super state or this deliberative body that would be international in the UN and it would preserve peace. But the idea here is if you have many more smaller states and the ability to migrate between them, that you're more likely, or that you're less likely to get, imperialism, you're less likely to get some of the bad stuff. And I think, Switzerland, Liechtenstein, Singapore, Hong Kong before being handed back over to China. All of these small city-state-like jurisdictions are interesting examples of these niches of possibility. And not to keep banging on, because I want to ask you a question about this. You really do have a problem, though, in imagining Du Puyt's panarchy. It's like, how do we get there from here? And I think that's the right next question. So I would ask you, how do you think we should get there from here? And is it there could be many different directions, but which do you think is the most promising?
I was sort of wondering at what point we were going to start talking about how do we get there from here versus kind of really painting more of a rich picture of what there looks like. But I think they end up being interrelated problems. So, I mean, I think it doesn't really matter where we go in the discussion. I mean, in some sense, I think part of it is recognizing the ways that we already have intimations of what there is, right? Like, we already have some, bundle of our economic activity in a country like the U.S. is through free economic choices. I mean, the market, there's constraints to the market as a whole, but like we can kind of choose, I can choose to get AT&T or Cox for my internet, right? There's places where I can make choices to enter into exchanges by different kinds of memberships or being a different kind of paying customer to different things, like Amazon is one, and I'm a Prime member, and some people don't want to be Prime members, and some people don't want to shop at Amazon. They want to shop at local bookstores and other kind of local retailers. And, these are choices that people have. You vote with your dollar, vote with your feet. Those kinds of ideas already exist. So kind of recognizing that, but then also, finding ways to, I suppose, like, find people that want to pool together things that maybe look a little bit more like the social services that a state kind of offers, and then subscribe there instead of to the state option. In a way, like, I don't know, there's places where markets where cryptocurrency, and this is another kind of gateway we've talked about in another episode, like, are these kind of gray markets, I suppose. They're not totally black market, like illegal things, but like people are kind of transferring at least some amount of their economic exchanges, like, out of the dollar system and into a cryptocurrency system, and creating resource pools over there.
So this is really an interesting thing. It's sort of like, now you're talking about fractionalizing even more the way that you
here, right? I mean, unless we have a bloody revolution and start chopping people's heads off like the French or whatever, you know what I'm saying? Like,
yeah.
minimize the violence. It's going to have to be fractional in this way, no? Like gradualistic?
Yeah, I mean, I don't see any other way around it, frankly. Now, there are governance innovations happening today, for example, and they are both top down and bottom up. This one example I'll give you. If you've ever heard of Prospera, I guess is the Spanish, in Honduras, is a special jurisdiction where a company, I think the company is Prospera, provides governance services in collaboration with a Honduran body, so that they're kind of a hybrid.
Mm-hmm.
I resist the term public-private partnership because that can open the doors to certain kind of corruption, and hopefully that won't happen to Prospera. But currently, that jurisdiction, at least in terms of its legal frameworks, is probably the freest in the world right now. Freest and most open to foreign direct investment and interesting things like that. That hasn't existed but a couple of years, and this company is brand new. And the idea of governance as a service provider, at least public-private service provider, rather than just like having to vote with your feet, which is also true in this case. But like the idea of public and private being kind of blurred in interesting ways, and the jurisdiction is super small. It's only going to be the size ever of a city, and right outside of that jurisdiction, you have the rest of Honduras, which still is under good old corrupt Honduran law.
Mm-hmm.
So, there are interesting things like these niches of experimentation that are happening.
Mm-hmm.
And the question is, to what degree? And so that's a territorial example, right? So that might be one path. So you basically persuade some other jurisdiction, some other country, the authorities in some other countries, to carve out space. The Hondurans are desperate. They're like, we want foreign direct investment. We want to get rid of our corruption. We want to try something new. So they passed the law to have special jurisdictions. People have come in and established these special jurisdictions, and we'll see the degree to which they grow.
Mm-hmm.
But not everything is territorial, as you point out. Sometimes you're going to have people who adopt cryptocurrencies. They say, this is cloud governance, right?
Right.
It's like, there's no territory at all. Bitcoin is everywhere and nowhere. Right. It is a jurisdiction in the cloud, but you have to fractionalize it in the sense that you say, okay, I still have to pay my taxes here if I'm in this specific jurisdiction, namely the United States. But at least I have the option of divesting from the fiat monetary system to some degree. There are network effects that keep you paying with dollars, of course, because everybody and their mother uses dollars, just like everybody and their mother uses Facebook, right? It's really hard to get out of that system, but it's still possible, right? People can go to Gab, people can go to Twitter, whatever. There are other options. Likewise with money now, there are other options with cryptocurrencies. They are imperfect in certain ways. There are trade-offs with respect to their properties, but it is another option. So the more options there are available and the more of their markets in this kind of governance, whether it's governance over money or governance over people, governance over neighborhoods. This kind of governance pluralism allows for more options and by default reduces the costs of exit.
Yep. There's you're reminding me of other couple other examples that I think of that I think are, if we're talking about how to get to there from here, it's just like we just do more of these kinds of things. Like, one is the internet protocols, right? Like, way down at the network layer, there's this thing called, TCP and IP, and they're like essentially like a data format that empowers all the internet all throughout the world. Now, if you think about like just how much of the world is hooked up to the internet, like it's a lot, right? It's not everybody. And, China has its great firewall, but it actually borrows some of these network protocols internal to its great firewall. But the standards, you might say, the agreement between like these, it's like an industry consortium, of like companies like Cisco or Intel or Microsoft or Amazon. I mean, I don't even know who they are, and state governments are also represented here in the consortium, but they're not like this kind of quasi celebrity thing that like our politicians are, kind of like on a stage, like performers, like actors and actresses, and we're all kind of glued to our news feeds, like what's the latest thing that this crazy politician said or whatever. Like, I don't even know who those people are that are governing the internet protocols, and it's almost like as it should be. I shouldn't really care that much about the decisions that they're making. I don't vote in any of their races, but their decisions affect something, some kind of utility that I'm using, right? But like the problem in a way is kind of like aggregating too many things under one entity, like a federal government or Washington DC. Instead, kind of like, can we just peel off a thing and say like, look, this thing here is just governed for the entire world of the users of the free internet, but we don't even know who they are, nor do we really care. If they really fucked up their job, we would scratch our heads and go like, hey, wait a minute, we should maybe change that somehow. But like, it's kind of a cool thing. You could sort of imagine this kind of jurisdiction that sort of blankets the globe, but it's very thinly sliced, and it's governed by not state politicians, right? It's governed by some kind of, I don't actually know what it is, but like there's some kind of council that governs
it could be a consortium. It might also not have any sort of force monopoly behind it. It might have triggers that any given organization that operates within the consortium has the ability to pull out of the consortium at any time, which is a check on its authority and power. And if too many defectors, and there might be a forking of the code, as it were, in tech speak, there's forking the code, but there might be costs to forking the code. So the members have to be very careful about making a decision of whether to start another consortium or another jurisdiction. These set of questions will happen all the way up and all the way down the stack, the governance stack, if you like. Right. And they're very interesting questions, but I think they militate, sorry to use that word, but because it's really nonviolent, that this is what we're trying to
maybe.
Yeah, necessitate. But these ideas really militate against this sort of Hobbesian notion that there has to be one big motherfucker to rule them all, to have the ring, and we have to oblige that big guy to be good. Right? That's the Hobbesian rationale at its root. And some people think that that's the only game in town from a game theoretical standpoint, that the guy, the entity with the biggest guns is the one that you have to make sure they're good. I think that logic has run its course. I know, and I used to some degree believe in the idea of like a contractarian rationale for establishing this kind of super state. I think a lot of people are still have the idea that the United States is a world constable, being a representative of democracy and protecting trade routes and all this stuff is on net a good thing. But as we say, power corrupts and absolute power corrupts, blah, 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 right? So I'm noticing the experimentations in the tech space, and they are giving us windows of possibility into a future that looks much different than what even the founders imagined.
Yeah. Yeah. It's cool. Like, I mean, I think if we're talking about governing things like in the tech space, Bitcoin is one, and there's a whole bunch of other cryptocurrencies, and some of them have these interesting forms of governing how the code changes are made. And, I suppose, you could, on the back end of Wikipedia, there's dispute resolution mechanisms there, and that's another sort of thin slice. I mean, a huge portion of the world uses Wikipedia, but Wikipedia doesn't really have any authority over our lives besides editing Wikipedia, right? Like, but you brought up this thing about the U.S. Navy protects the world's trade routes, and whatever 100+ years ago it was the British Navy. Like it does. And now I'm going to try to channel some skeptics of this thing that we're talking about. Like,
absolutely, we got to have that.
We have to solve for that function, right? I mean, what happened? Is it like the U.S. Navy turns into like a private entity that, like, the shipping container companies with their giant shipping ships, like, pay to, like, stop
that could happen.
Pirates? Stop the pirates? I mean, how does that?
Yeah.
How does that work?
Well, we already have that. Sometime on the show, we got to get Joe Quirk on the show. Joe Quirk is with the Seasteading Institute.
Okay.
And he basically points out that, apart from the UN's law of the sea, which most jurisdictions acknowledge, I think, except for the United States, that there is some governance systems on the ocean, but it's very thin. And so you have Lloyd's of London insuring vessels, and they have their own protective mechanisms that they're willing to invest in to ensure that security, because to pay out some large sum to victims of piracy might be more expensive than paying for, protective agencies or whatever. So there's interesting insurance and market mechanisms that we could see develop or emerge that we might not be able to anticipate right now, but certainly the existing frameworks give us clues. Something we might not be able to anticipate at all could emerge, but there is enough there that we can see the possibilities. And just like you can have a polycentric state of affairs with certain jurisdictions, both on land and in the cloud, you could also start to see polycentric defense. We saw polycentric defense work well for 500 years in the past, and that was with the Hanseatic League. The Hanseatic League only broke up after 500 years because of the 30 Years' War. That's an interesting history in and of itself. And of course, the 30 Years' War, we start to see the rise of Leviathan powers in that region, which may be counter to what I'm arguing here. But Switzerland has managed to stay a tiny, city-state, not a city-state, but a small state with a federalized system. With, the canton system has been maintained. They've been around for quite a long time, more than 100 years, and it has had a lot of stability. And they even got through 2 world wars with their neutrality. Some people would say, "Oh, well, hell, they should have been involved because it was wrong for them to stay out in the face of such evil." But they survived, they weren't war-torn, and they didn't adopt a system because really, the authoritarian powers of World War II, whether you like it or not, we became more like them because of World War II. That's a hard thing to say, especially to people who are patriotic and whose parents fought in the wars and all that stuff. And I'm not saying we shouldn't have gotten into World War II, as the United States government should not have made that happen. But what I am saying is the military-industrial complex grew on the back of that war and never stopped growing, and it's not stopped since. So,
I mean, I'm going to channel another kind of oppositional voice here by saying, like, but isn't that better, right? I mean, don't we look at like the history of Europe all the way up to World War II as just being just constantly in some kind of state of war, religious wars or interstate wars, and this whole kind of like chaos of international treaties is what started World War I to begin with, because there wasn't. And like now, you could say that the emergence of the EU, or the relative peace between the major European powers, is partly ensured by things like the US sort of took over naval protection and provided this like nuclear umbrella, right? Like, and we're like just some kind of other external Leviathan, you know what I mean? Like, wouldn't going to polycentrism kind of like devolve us back into this state of like, international brinksmanship? I mean, other kinds of game theoretic dynamics, like races to the bottom, or like escalating conflict, like we see kind of happening, with Putin and Russia and Crimea and now the Ukraine. I mean, like, isn't that what we're inviting back in if we do this polycentric thing? Like, isn't it better to have an international power, like keeping a cap on the whole thing?
Well, and it's arguable that the international power keeping a cap on it is actually working anymore. I mean, look what just happened to Afghanistan. We had a bunch of tribal groups essentially run us out of their country. Not us. The greatest fighting force in the world just got ran out after 20 years by people who live in caves and use anti-aircraft missiles and stuff like that. Like, these people things. Like, yeah, it's amazing what they were able to achieve with a polycentric defense force. And I say it's polycentric because even though we think of them as the bad guys, and certainly they are to a very great degree, the Al-Qaeda and ISIS and the Taliban all operated within Afghanistan at certain points, and the Taliban and Al-Qaeda still exist there, and they cooperated, collaborated, and used decentralized means to run off the Leviathan force. So I'm not sure that asymmetrical warfare isn't the age we're turning to. I know that we still have these massive nuclear armed powers, and I agree with the skeptics of this podcast that, there are some risks. There would be some risks involved in such radical decentralization. But I also think that we're moving into an age where more and more value is not in territorial expansion. Throughout history, when we had agrarian societies and rudimentary industrial societies, territorial expansion made a lot of sense from an economic standpoint, and economics drives war in a lot of cases, or at least the misapprehension of economics. It's like a lot of people think Japan attacked Pearl Harbor because we had, we're denying them oil and part of an oil embargo because of their bellicosity, and that conflagration war happened. Okay, there's a lot of other theories behind this, and I'm not dead sure on the history there, so I say that with all humility. However, I think the idea of an overwhelming global constable that was fairly liberal in its outlook, democratic republics and all that good stuff is what it protected in its trading partners, worked for a while. But I don't think it's really working all that much anymore. Now, you could say, well, it's working to the extent that we don't have as much war anymore. But again, to what degree is territorial expansion really what we're after in an age where more value is not so much in land, but in other places, in the knowledge economy, for example.
Sure.
And that's where a lot of the war is happening now.
True. Like the cyber warfare, the information warfare, the hacking, and the mind viruses, and this psychological warfare.
And that's already polycentric.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, we're in a weird moment because, we often talk about, like, you got to talk about as compared to what, right? And if we're kind of comparing it to some kind of ideal pie in the sky, like, everyone can imagine utopias, and comparing things to utopias is not a good way of making an argument for how to do things differently. But I mean, you're basically saying like, hey, look at the ways that this kind of like cycles of empire, and the US is just the latest one, kind of start to crack and fall apart. And all right, so let's see if we can improve upon that, right? But we can compare that thing, even in its fractured state right now, to something that maybe was worse, which was all the bloody conflicts of the European powers, et cetera, like the infighting. And I do think there's a kind of an issue in game theory dynamics, is like when you have too many centers of power, right? You do kind of enter into, I suppose, states of uncertainty, and it kind of can incentivize the kind of brinksmanship that creates a bunch of local conflicts. So even if the cap on the thing is failing in all these interesting ways, like Afghanistan example you brought up, but it's still better than the previous thing. Like, we got to create something that somehow, and like, here's, instead of arguing over, two different versions of the past that don't work, like, what would it look like if it was working? I mean, we're still, physical being, as much as even as more and more of our economics takes place on the internet, we're still like, in our houses and homes and apartments that like sit upon land, and we eat food comes from crops that grow out of the ground, and we're grazing animals and so forth. Like, I mean, there's some way that whatever these constructs are, these creative polycentric governance constructs are, they have to interface with the gross physical realm at some level. And if maybe territorial expansion incentives are different than the way that they used to be, but it does still sort of seem like, if you could wrap your army around some of that land over there, like, then you're kind of like, able to make more unilateral choices about how to use the resources. I mean, it's just
let's try this. Let's try this. What if, let's just say that the very hawkish neocon idea of a global constable is correct. I'm just going to grant that for a moment. In fact, I used to believe that. I was a fan of the Iraq War on those grounds, and I regret it to this day. I was wrong, I believe. And we can have that conversation in another episode, because I'm curious to know how you felt about it back then and how you feel about it now. But what's interesting about that is that, let's just for a moment grant that old Max was right and that the neocons are right and that Max today is wrong.
Okay.
What if we had the ability to say, okay, then the federal government is only responsible for national defense, and that's it, and everything else is decentralized.
Kind of minarchism. That's minarchism, or a form of it, right?
That would be minarchism, and maybe the minarchists are right. It's still a question of like, okay, how do we get there from here? And it may be that all these little jurisdictions have to pay the piper to this big dog, and we still have to oblige this big dog, the U.S. military. It's going to be preserved, and the military-industrial complex is still likely to expand. That we still have to pay into that system and expect that there is a blanket of protection that comes along with it, but it's responsible for nothing else.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, if you're
sort
talking
of like
about anarchism being better, what does the polycentric thing look like? Are you saying this is a version of the polycentric thing where there's some kind of like coalitional militia force that kind of like has, we got to sort of appeal to in the case of dispute resolution, and it's kind of like, all right, it's not necessarily, it maybe some kind, it sort of looks like UN peacekeeping forces, I suppose, where people in different uniforms all kind of sort of show up as a big gang whenever they're needed, and then they disperse afterwards. I suppose that's sort of like the state militias of the colonial period in the US, more than just some kind of giant, we can
even imagine a big monopolistic power where states agree to or not pay this power for its protection. So it's not a direct to consumer thing, but there's still the ability to, to pull out of it pull out of any agreement with it. And then, of course, you might be vulnerable to it occupying you.
But yeah, where do you go if there is just one ginormo, global security force, and you're like, they'll let you leave, but if you leave, they're like, cool, well, we're not gonna like do anything to stop people from like, piracy or breaking and entering. Like, you're fucking on your own now. You gotta like get your own gun. I mean, this is like recreating.
Look at that,
isn't it?
We're up to the whims of this kind of stuff now, right? All of Europe has lived under a blanket of protection from the United States in the Cold War era. It's not to say that those governments don't have their own militaries, but they're quite small by comparison. I mean, our military dwarfs theirs. And from a nuclear arms standpoint, we have provided I say the United States government and U.S. taxpayers have provided a blanket of protection for decades since World War II. And they have free ridden on that. There's been free riding, right? Right now, the Ukraine. Right now, Biden's talking about protecting the Ukraine, which is not even in NATO.
Right.
There was the protection of Kuwait when Iraq invaded Kuwait, who was a neighboring oil state, and it's because there was oil interest there. So the problems often cut both ways. And you're right. We always have to ask as compared to what.
Right.
So, yeah, but asking as compared to what cuts both ways. We can still, we can't be mired in the status quo forever, because we're starting to see signs that this order is breaking down, and China is ascendant from a military standpoint. No doubt about it.
At least in the region, for sure.
Yeah.
So,
but I would like to stick with the United States internally for the time being, because I think thinking of this on a global scale and having the military be like the checkmate against these ideas doesn't really do the job. Okay, because you can still have a high degree of polycentric order within the country.
Well, then where that starts to appear, and I kind of want to share with you some of my ideas and thoughts on this, to see what you think in terms of how they would work. But like, even if we kind of get rid of the global military thing, the internal version is the police, right? Like security for like, hey, stop somebody from robbing me. If you're kind of like, wait a minute, I don't just automatically get the city police. I got to kind of pick my police. And I suppose you could be like, well, I suppose there are private security forces. There's private investigators and other kind of like, rent-a-cops. You can, Pinkertons or whatever. Like there is some privatization of like, guns, groups of dudes with guns and shit. Does it all just turn into like, you get Pinkertons and I get the whatever, the mall cops or whatever, it's like, is that what it starts to look like internally? Like, and then if there's a dispute between like my gang of dudes and your gang of dudes, and we're subscribed, like AT&T versus Cox, except these are like dudes in uniforms with guns, like, and then like, okay, well then how do we resolve that? Or do they just like shoot it out? I mean, like,
shooting,
weird,
right? Yeah, of course. I mean, police protection agencies. If we can imagine a free market in police protection agencies, some of them will have to be based on territory, because you want these entities to protect you, your home, your family, and all that stuff, right? But some of them might be further away from you, and to some extent, and people who live in rural areas, there's all kinds of questions around that. What does that look like? But at the end of the day, you're providing people with a service.
Mm-hmm.
In one situation, let's look at the two situations. One situation, you're a citizen, which is only just slightly better than a subject, right? A citizen is a subject in democratic clothing. Okay. And democracy, we know, is a terrible feedback loop. Okay,
you have to pay your taxes, city taxes, and they fund the police, and you're getting that service, but you're stuck with that service.
But you're stuck, yeah, and they're making you pay your debt to society. But we can imagine protective associations. We can imagine protective associations that are more, who they don't want to go into conflict with other protective associations. It's very, very costly, both in human lives and in treasure, to go to war with them. So what are they going to do? They're going to have arbitration agreements between themselves, right? They're going to have insurance. They're going to have all kinds of other mechanisms for resolving disputes, agreeing to in advance to dissolve disputes between them, just as people do internationally. If I go to Canada and commit a crime, or a Canadian comes here to commit a crime, we have all kinds of mechanisms to sort out what's supposed to happen within a jurisdiction. Some of those might be territorial goods and some of those might not be. But at the end of the day, these protective associations are going to be customer focused, which means I have the ability to vote with my dollars and my feet from a lot of these associations. And that is going to create incentives for change. For example, moving away from a system of paying your debt to society in criminal law and paying your debt to the victim in terms of compensation. A more compensatory emergent law is likely to form, and it's going to be lower cost to have some harmony among systems of law. These are all interesting things that we see out on the high seas with, the Lloyds of London phenomenon and the international flagging of vessels and things like this. But it's not enough to talk about what's really could happen on land. That said, David Friedman is an economist and legal theorist out in California.
Son, right?
Yes, son. Yeah, he has some really, really interesting ideas on how all this will work, and we can put that in the show notes.
He wrote Machines of Freedom, right? That was his one of his books on how to
Machinery of Freedom. Yeah,
Machinery of Freedom. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So
look, this doesn't have to be anarchist. His is just straight up anarchism, right? He's just describing anarcho-capitalism. Right. But you might have a jurisdiction that pools resources in some way, that is more traditional, and that's different from the way they do things in another jurisdiction. And we have to figure out how to harmonize between and among jurisdictions now anyway.
Let me take some of the things that you said and kind of paint a more clear, like more details to it and give it a little bit more color, right? Like, I think I'm getting what you're saying, right? What you're saying is a few different things kind of mashed up together. Like, one is like, hey, a lot of the security forces, in order to keep their prices down, the market motivation to get more customers, right? Like a network effect, they're going to actually want to avoid kind of the most expensive forms of conflict. So what they will do is they'll resort to things that we kind of already have in tort law or private contract law, where like binding arbitration clauses, right? So instead of like appealing to necessarily the public courts, they can go to, and they agree to abide by the adjudication, and that's the way they kind of keep their costs down, right? And maybe one of them has to pay the fees of the other one in order to do that if they're the loser in the case or something like that. But that all kind of cashes out in their budgets and in the income that they're receiving by the people who like buy these security policies or subscribe to these security policies from them, right? I mean, that's kind of what you're saying about like how it would work, right? And essentially what you're sort of doing is you're kind of like nudging things that we sort of like appeal to kind of criminal law, statutory law, and like the public court systems funded by, the taxpayers who pay for these, courtrooms and judges and bailiffs and, these kinds of things. And instead what you have is these, security coalitions that, in order to kind of keep their prices down, are going to be incentivized towards peaceful dispute resolution, and then the resolution of things that maybe, under our current conception sort of fall onto the criminal side. Maybe they don't look like criminal problems anymore. They look more kind of like
right,
contract dispute problems, which is more kind of what we think of as civil law rather than criminal law, right? Is this kind of
or law of torts,
and things kind of like more and more of our stuff sort of moves into these kind of like peaceful resolutions rather than like different gangs of people with guns. I mean, the guns are still there, and maybe shooting does break out some of the time, but it's I suppose, kind of kept more to a minimum, right? Like,
let me
is
put
that
it
right?
like this.
It's like
I
what
mean,
you're
I
talking
mean,
about.
yeah, I think so. I mean, I think that sounds like a really fairly accurate description of what I think is likely to occur. But we need the opportunity to create niches of experimentation to see if I'm right. Because right now we have a monopolistic system that pretty much one jurisdiction resembles the other across the entire United States, and in fact the world. And it's there's a path dependency with respect to it now, and to overcome that path dependency, we need room to experiment. We don't want to tear down Chesterton's fence entirely. We just want a space to see if we can do something better. Because here's the truth, and here's where my market fundamentalism is laid bare. Okay. And that's that I believe when I join a friend of mine, Michael Strong, in this belief, he articulates what he calls Strong's Law.
Mm-hmm.
And Strong's Law says, and I'm paraphrasing here, I might mangle it, but essentially the application of entrepreneurial effort towards anything is likely to generate better, faster, cheaper, higher quality, good stuff, goods and services
Mm-hmm.
than any other system. In other words, when people are trying their hardest to serve you in a sustainable way by getting those certificates of performance, whether that's your dollars or your cryptocurrency, they're more likely it's going to be create incentives of service to you. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
And if they're operating within a competitive landscape, they're much more likely to try to seek to satisfy your needs, whereas monopolies, especially government monopolies, do not.
Got
So the idea here is, to whatever practicable extent we can apply the market mechanism, namely entrepreneurial zeal, to supplying human wants and needs in domains that we have generally thought of as being for the common good or public good or blah blah blah. Like, people, recite this stuff endlessly because they don't know how to think otherwise.
Mm-hmm.
We need these niches of experimentation to say maybe it would work better with this. And it's not always about markets. We can imagine, again, these clusters of system clusters that might resemble states in certain ways, but you subscribe to the system. And if this system doesn't work well after a year, you might be able to subscribe to another governance system that bundles these goods and services and achieves some sort of economies of scale out of it. We don't know what it's going to look like, but at the end of the day, it's really about applying the spirit of competition and innovation and entrepreneurship to places that we generally think of have to be administered by technocrats. And that fails over and over again. And it's failing today.
Right. So, I love the, idea of this kind of competitive landscape, and it almost like, if we give people the option to leave, or we allow this entrepreneurial mindset to kind of be a part of the innovation, then there's this kind of belief, and this is the market fundamentalism you talked about, that the quality of these services will improve, and they will essentially improve over and above the ways that a state version of it fails, because once you kind of bundle it under the state, where you kind of have this monopoly on power over a certain territory, you sort of eliminate competition, or you severely dampen it, such that that now more and more waste can aggregate, more and more bureaucratic red tape, and this kind of general libertarian argument against these kind of ways of aggregating.
Well, and the libertarians, I think, have a point, and not only a good point when it comes to that, but I also think that non-libertarians are starting to see it quite a bit. I mean, after all, we're living in an era where people actually utter defund the police.
Right.
And it's sort of like, I wanted to say, yeah, and refund it in a different way, right? It's like, you're going to see problems of corruption and capture and massive pensions, where California is another example, where your public servants are are, living to be 80 something years old, and they're retiring at 45, and the pension payouts are, if it weren't for the Federal Reserve and the bailouts that happened because of COVID, California was going down the toilet in terms of its fiscal solvency. That's not true anymore for various reasons that we can talk about, and we're all paying for it in the forms of higher inflation. But this is a problem, and California and Texas, for that matter, hasn't reformed their systems to any appreciable degree that would help solve those corruptive elements of monopolies that get captured.
Yep. So I want to keep painting a picture of more what it could look like, and some of the things are kind of pointing to examples of things that already exist, like common law versus statutory law, or private dispute resolution versus using the court system. Another one that I like is the co-op movement. Co-op movement has been around for a long time, and co-ops represent actually a significant portion of the economy, not the majority of the economy, but the co-ops are sort of different between, they're different than states, and they're different than private corporations, and they usually have some kind of internal governance system. And in Spain, there's this thing called Mondragon, which is a giant federation of co-ops, and they've been around for nearly 100 years now. And they have their own kind of banks internally and finance, and I don't know if they have their own security forces and these kinds of things, but this is another thing where it's sort of there's a big chunk of the Spanish economy that's under, you might say, the jurisdiction of Mondragon.
Yeah.
And it's it's actually, when the Spanish economy maybe kind of fluctuates a lot more, the Mondragon population sort of stays a little bit more stable. They take care of their own, and right, this kind of thing.
Well, yeah, and we can't really go into it in this conversation, I don't think, but in a future conversation with you, I really want to talk about holacracy.
Sure.
Maybe we can get Brian Robertson on the show and talk about holacracy. That would be great. Really super cool.
It's another example of something that exists that could be used in this kind of scheme.
Yes, exactly. I think governance systems, if we're not super ideological and we're more pragmatic about the trade-offs and the risks and concerns of people with respect to monopolistic, violence monopolies, aka governments, that the scalability of systems like this and their ability to change is much more interesting and possible. Because now I think we're on a decline.
Totally. Let's maybe leave this as kind of a teaser for the future and do some closing thoughts here on this. Another example is in the crypto space, what are called DAOs, or decentralized autonomous organizations. And I think even just recent weeks, was it Wyoming passed a legal entity format for DAOs?
Yeah, I think it's Wyoming. Yeah, DAOs are now legal there. Maybe, or that's what I had heard as well, or at least they were trying.
Right.
And if you don't know what a DAO is, can you explain briefly before we have to go what a DAO is?
Well, I mean, it's basically finding a way of creating this network effect, aggregating a collective group of actors together for some kind of purpose that gives them some way of participating in the exchange of some kind of, we're saying, one of these thin layer public services, or social services or goods or something like that, where they have some means of essentially governing how those things are distributed in a way that doesn't appeal to a corporate CEO or board of directors for a privately held company, or something like a state where it's I'm paying taxes and I'm supposed to vote, and that's how it works, right? There's another way of doing it where it's a pool that's larger scale than just a simple locality, geographically speaking, but it's maybe sort of smaller scale than one of these giant behemoths the U.S. government in Washington, D.C. And it's an innovative and interesting new way of organizing.
And they can use
Go ahead.
different consensus mechanisms. So
Right.
this not always 50% plus one or 60% plus one. It can be, dominant assurance contracts. It can be, which is sort of Kickstarter like in the way it's implemented. It could be,
Quadratic voting, all kinds of weird shit.
quadratic voting. Yeah. So it could be liquid democracy. There's all kinds of different, proxy voting is liquid democracy. There's all kinds of ways that you can operate a DAO where people can use their preferred consensus mechanism. And, if someone's invited me to be in a DAO right now and they say, oh, we just use majoritarian voting, I'd be like, no, thanks.
Right.
We have enough of that shit here. Right. It's crap. I'm sorry. I don't have any use for democracy at all. Sorry.
Well, here's where I kind of want to leave the listeners, and just to kind of point to this brighter future. Like, it doesn't, just because we're talking about like the decay of this kind of like cycles of empire in the US is just the latest version, it doesn't mean we have to kind of regress to like, the Greek city states, or, the endless religious wars of, pre-modern Europe or something like this. We can actually push it into the future by thinking of what the internet and digital technologies enable. They enable jurisdictions that can actually span, like, geographically, domains that are actually larger geographically than city states, right? But you might say they're sort of thinner than just Leviathan kind of nation states, right? And it's kind of cool. Like, it's novel. I want to say that it's sort of brings some ingredients of like a more decentralized past together with some of the benefits and network effects of the aggregated giant nation state, but it's, different than both of those things. And I think this is where polycentrism and polyarchy hasn't actually fully had its day in the sun yet. And that's because we haven't had the technological infrastructure built to support it yet, but we're building it right now. Right, the crypto economy is a major pillar of this.
Well, this is a great note to end on. I really appreciate you opening the door to that, and I think that's beautifully said, Porch, because really, at the end of the day, this is never ever going to be perfect, right? And in fact, nobody knows what perfect is. They might claim to know what perfect is, but the key here is to create shoots of experimentation in an evolutionary fitness landscape to see what prevails and what does not. At the end of the day, whether you like Darwin or not, that process works. Okay. Yes. The stuff either works or it don't.
Right.
Okay. So if you have some conception of the good, some bundle of goods and services, some system that you want to instantiate, you've got not only to draw people into your orbit and keep them, but that those that you draw into the orbit have to be self-sustaining in terms of revenues and excessive cost, in terms of defecting members. If they're not happy, they're going to leave. This creates competitive forces that are really interesting. And it's really about trying to find ways to transition from systems of compulsion to systems of choice or consent-based systems are what we're after, and that unleashes those competitive dynamics. It's never going to be perfect, and the powers that be are sure as hell not interested in letting you have these experiments. So we're going to have to get really creative really fast, especially as we continue our decline as a nation.
Right on, Max. This has been super fun, and stay tuned for more, because this is like one of our favorite topics, and I'm sure we'll be revisiting it in different ways in future episodes. But like, I do think this conversation about, what does the civilization of the future look like, and the polycentric order and the polyarchy and panarchy, these kind of things have been imagined in the past by theorists and experimented with, is only going to grow. Like, that's my bet. If I had to predict, this, sector of political economy is going to grow and eventually will kind of outcompete the systems that we have felt basically just stuck with because we didn't know there was even an alternative. I just think in the years to come, we're going to see a lot more interesting and successful experiments in governance.
Amen. Amen, brother. The world is becoming way too complex, and the more complex it becomes, our systems have to adapt to that complexity. If not, boom, collapse.
All right, everybody, come back to visit with Max and me here at Social Evolution. Thanks for listening. Thanks for watching if you watched us. And yeah, much more to come. Take care.